Moolman is going to be joining us at 4:30, coming off the heels of the Utah Pride Festival here in Salt Lake City. We're going to hear from Rob. He's going to stop into the studio, so I'm without a guest to start. But it is a beautiful day in Salt Lake City. I think that summer has maybe finally arrived or finally taken a peek at us, because it's been challenging weather here in Utah. It's been a long, wet spring, and it's always good to see the water in Utah. We'd rather see too much water than not enough. So Lake Powell filling up, and hopefully the fire hazard will be low this summer with all of the water that we've had. But I know that they worry now about the runoff. There's so much up there. Do you know, Alan? It's a record snow year up at Snowbird with over, I think, 700 inches. I think there comes a point where they even may stop measuring, so it gets kind of unreliable. But
wow.
Snowbird has had a record snowfall this year. And finally, an absolutely beautiful shorts day, a summer day here in Utah. So a day to enjoy. That time of year where you can ski in Utah and play golf.
Right.
And so I got to drop a little golf news into the Utah news. But Tony Finau is in the news today, not for his runner-up finish in the tournament a week and a half ago. Local golf legend Tony Finau is sponsoring a Utah golfer, a former BYU golfer, Patrick Fishburne, who is on one of the lower mini tours, and he's from Fremont High School, a BYU golfer, and the first to receive financial support from the Tony Finau Foundation. And Tony, it took him, Alan, I was lucky enough to watch Tony Finau when he was in high school. And I saw him a bunch of times. I saw him beat Daniel Summerhays in the Utah State Championship. I think it was in 2006 in a 36-hole match out at Soldier Hollow in Midway. And they both went on to play professional golf. I don't know where Daniel stands these days, but he got his big break, Daniel Summerhays, when he won the nationwide tournament. I'm not sure if it was the one that was here in town, and they are here in town now, but Daniel won that tournament, won a professional tournament, and then elected to turn pro right away, which he did, and he didn't go on to BYU. He had planned to go to BYU, the great Summerhays golf family. I didn't plan on launching into golf, but here I go. Yeah. But that affected his career, and then Tony Finau took a shot and turned professional just after high school, and struggled on mini tours for 6-7 years. And he was such a phenomenal talent that you knew it was just a matter of time before he arrived. But I saw him back in high school when he played for West High. Okay. Over in Rose Park, and Tony's got a great story of growing up in a big family. I think there were 7 of them, a family of limited means, Polynesian immigrants. I'm not sure how far back, but I know his dad worked for Delta Airlines, Gary, out supporting his boys. And Tony learned how to hit golf balls in his garage into a mattress. And over at the little Rose Park golf course, where I had the pleasure of watching he and his brother Gipper practice little 40-yard chip shots into the setting sun of Salt Lake City back in 2006, 2007. But that tournament, the nationwide tournament's back in town, and it's good to see that the Tony Finau Foundation is playing a role in it and giving back. Utah Pride, I know that Tony's a source of it. I know that, and he's always touting his accomplishments off of the golf course as much as on. But Utah's in the news about volunteerism on the heels of our Utah Pride celebration. And in KSL leading story, the most generous state in America in terms of volunteer time. And I love these news articles that have these comparative rates to see, where you stand against others.
Other states.
And I've spoken in the past about a little bit of a cultural insecurity here in Utah that I think sometimes exists. We're on an island here in Utah. Yeah. And we like to see how we stack up against those not on the island. And, the island has changed over the years dramatically, including a culture at BYU commencement speech that I'm going to talk about in a minute or two. But the culture with respect to the LGBT community has changed dramatically, and it's interesting to me that that fight or conflict, if you will, between those seeking, individual rights with respect to their sexuality and those seeking to protect religious rights with respect to their religious traditions. The Utah and the LDS Church is no stranger to that conflict. And has been, some would say at odds with the LGBT community for some period of time, whether it's here in Utah or in legislation in California or in Washington, D.C. I think it's pretty well documented that there's a public dispute on how to reconcile those conflicting interests in our public lives.
Right.
Because I think that most people on both sides of those issues, whether you're talking about the individual rights with respect to sexuality or the individual rights with respect to religious beliefs and adherence, I think that most people believe that both of those things are worthy of being protected.
Right.
And I just find it interesting that Utah, of all places, is sort of providing some groundwork for those changes, and you can feel it living here. You can feel it in the news here. But before we get to the BYU commencement, back to volunteerism. So don't get too thrilled by these statistics because they're pretty low thresholds, but a newspaper article about statistics released by the Corporation for National and Community Service and how there is an increase in volunteerism. But they define that by at least once a year, volunteering at least once a year.
One time?
Yes, once a year.
Okay.
And we've got 30% or a third of American adults volunteer at least once a year. So I don't think that it's a very great threshold. Maybe we've got momentum going in the right way.
What percentage was that?
30.3%
of our age
have volunteered in the last year. But a couple of things in this article that I think are important that I think the younger generation understands. And this is from the Corporation for National and Community Service. Volunteering strengthens the foundation of any neighborhood or community, magnifying the ability to perform good works and contribute to the greater good, advocates say. Then goes into some statistics, and Utah fares pretty well. But then it asks toward the end of this survey, what motivates people to volunteer and what are the side benefits to volunteerism? And believe it or not, they're saying that career advancement, and I say believe it or not, maybe I'm the stupid one in the room. But career advancement, that volunteerism and sort of that community effort is opening doors for people.
Financial incentive.
And they cite a couple of other things here. I want to take issue with one of them. They say volunteering boosts self-esteem. But then they say it may help people feel better about themselves because they see their problems aren't as bad as the people they're helping.
Okay.
And I think that one bothers me a little bit. And hopefully that's not what is really at the core of volunteerism, but that it's more finding some satisfaction in helping others, but while also doing something for yourself. And that's what this article culminates with, right? And I think that's the true value in volunteering, not to do a comparison about how badly others have it, but to have some satisfaction in being on part of a team and contributing to something good. That ties in a little bit to what we had last week, Alan. I had on Stuart Goffman, the creator and executive director of A&E's docuseries Addiction Unplugged. And Stuart was a great guest, spent an hour and a half with us. There are 10 episodes filmed, and they're filming a finale this week. And I saw on LinkedIn that we have some Utah people actually going to that rally, including the Attorney General Sean Reyes, who Stuart praised last week, and so that while I'm highlighting, problems that we have here in Utah with respect to addiction and housing and employment opportunities, there's lots of things happening here in Utah to be applauded to help provide for some of those things. And so it'll be interesting to see. I think we struck a little gold when we got him on the program last week with Addiction Unplugged, because they already were working on a Utah angle, if you will, right?
Yeah, sound like it.
In that program last week, I spoke a little bit about the different societal influences on our mental health, which may lead people to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. And I cited specifically, I may be getting redundant here, football, the military, and religious pressures. I didn't speak about drug abuse in the LGBT community. We will certainly talk about that today, but we certainly see in that community a conflict often with people who they believe they are and religious standards that they also want to hold dear and believe in. Often, part of their childhood indoctrination, the basis for relationships among their friends and family, and trying to reconcile those two things. And there was really something amazing happened here in Utah just a couple of weeks ago that made the national news, and now I've got to grab my notes. But the valedictorian at BYU commencement. Oh, you okay? Okay. Oh, good. We've got a guest. So this is perfect. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had Matt Easton. And Matt grew up in Salt Lake City, adherent to the local LDS church, studied political science, served a mission in Sydney, Australia, and enrolled at BYU. And before he gave the speech, he presented a copy of it. Well, he came out in the speech as an openly gay member and a believer of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so he didn't do that without some permission ahead of time. He had enough sense and respect to submit a copy of his speech to the university for approval before he did it. And he actually didn't think that it would be approved. And lo and behold, it was approved, including some, remarks about just some supportive remarks by the church itself, if you will. Mm-hmm. Part of what inspired this young man to do that was just a few weeks earlier seeing a politician in South Bend, Indiana, a Democrat, looking to run for president out of Notre Dame country. Pete, I'll destroy his name, Buttigieg, Buttigieg, Democrat out of South Bend, a 37-year-old mayor who's also in politics. And so it's interesting that this young man was inspired by a Democrat because he is a political science honor society graduate and acts as the Republican state delegate for his home precinct in Cottonwood Heights, Utah. And he was met with, I think, a few gasps, but mostly applause from the audience at BYU. And when I come back, I'm going to have Rob Moolman in, who's relatively new to Utah, and boy, is it a different Utah. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Talk with Ted. Welcome back to Tuesday edition of Talk with Ted. It's 4:23 on June 4th, is it? June 4th, 2019. Feels like the first day of summer. And I just had a new friend come in and sit down with me. Would you introduce yourself to us?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Moolman. I'm the Executive Director of the Utah Pride Center, and happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month, Rob. Your accent, where are you from, Rob?
I'm from originally South African, although I moved here to Utah about 3.5 years ago from Australia.
Oh, you've been here that long, 3.5
Yes, I have.
years.
Yep.
Okay. I must be reading an old story or two about you
Maybe.
that had you here for a shorter period of time than that. Executive Director of the Utah Pride Center. How long have you been doing that?
I've been the Executive Director of the Pride Center
There
for
we
about
go.
a year and a half. Beg your pardon, just over a year. But prior to that, I was on the board of the Pride Center. So I'm intimately acquainted with the workings and the amazing work that the center does. So yeah, I've been very lucky.
We know that there was a big party this past week.
A little bit.
So now, what are you back to this week, right after the party? Because it's got to be more than the party.
Absolutely, and I think that's the thing that people forget about the Pride Festival here in Utah. So this week is a little crazy, as with all really big
You're
parties.
We've been cleaning up from the party.
Yes, I spent
You got the
yesterday.
bill from the city yet?
Yeah, not yet. I spent yesterday on those grounds picking up some trash and cleaning up some of the stuff. But yeah, you know, what we've got to remember is that the Pride Festival and the parade, and while it's fabulous and celebratory, is really a fundraiser for the Utah Pride Center. And the work that the center does is really try to look after the health and well-being of the broader Utah LGBT community. We do programs such as our transaction program. We have a program for people of color and allies. We have a youth program. We have a senior LGBT program. And then we also do services, mental health services. So we've got mental health counselors that are working at the center, and we look at individual therapy, couples therapy, family therapy, and a number of group therapies for all sorts of varying different identities and gender identities. Yeah.
I find it interesting you're talking about mental health resources that quickly into the description of the center.
Yeah.
Is that really at the core of it?
I think if you had to look at it if you had to draw a diagram, I think part of the core is exactly mental health and well-being and social well-being, and that broader picture of what mental health looks like, particularly in a space which sometimes doesn't approve of, doesn't recognize, doesn't enjoy your identity being out and proud. So yes, our other programs, our youth programs, our, as I said, people of color programs or trans programs, while they're social, while they're educative, while all of those things, I think at the core of it, you hit the nail on the head, Ted. It really is about mental health and social well-being.
Where is the Utah Pride Center?
We have for a year been located right behind Smith's Baseball Park. We had an amazing grand opening about a year ago, May 17th, just a little bit more than a year ago now. As I was coming on as director.
Are you on West Temple?
We're on Main Street.
It's on Main Street.
1380 Main.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a great space. It used to be a credit union, and then it was the Mexican consulate, and it is like the place was built for us. It's amazing.
And how many people do you have working there on a full-time basis?
We have around 20 people working there, I'd say. I'd say about 20 people. Obviously, over Pride time, it increases dramatically. We have far more people coming in to help with Pride. We usually have, sorry, just before I get to the other ones, we have about 2,000 people who'll come through that center every month. Wow. So it's a space,
2,000?
Yeah.
And you say come through that center. Dumb that down for me a little bit.
So through our programs, who will be in that space every month, our data is showing 2,000 people. So that could be for one of a number of reasons. It could be for a program. It could be for the mental health services. It could be for an event. Well, generally we didn't count the events that month, or those months, but it could be for coming to participate with one of our other community partners who we also provide space for. So we have organizations like the Human Rights Campaign that meets there. We have the LGBT affirming therapists that meet there. The LGBT Chamber of Commerce meets there monthly. So we've included
any
the number of
refugee
people.
groups?
We don't have any refugee groups at the moment. Unfortunately, I think that there is a large space for queer refugees, and we need that space. We don't have that at the moment, and it's something we should be thinking about. But we're trying to connect with as many different organizations as we can at the moment, and I know that that's a gap for us.
So let me see if I can break it down even more simply. What were you doing before you came over here today?
Today, I was just trying to collect myself after Pride. I've been answering like 3 weeks of unanswered emails. So if anybody's listening who I owe an email to, I'm sorry about that. So I have been really trying to think on what our next steps are. I think we do live with this huge big monster that is the Pride Festival. It consumes most of May and a little bit of consumes a lot of time, but May and April for us. But really, now the work starts, and now it's the really important work that gets going. And what we have had an incredibly successful Pride this year. It means that we're able to think a little bit more broadly, strategically, but we also need to make sure that we almost pick up where we left off and we start. When are those programs starting again? When are those people coming back into the centre to access the mental health services or the group support services? How are we making sure that our calendar is up and running so that everyone can find their space? Yeah.
What's your background in education? How did you end up with this position?
I was very lucky. So my background in education was a senior school teacher for many, many years. And then I did some work in academia. I've worked with the University of Melbourne for many years. And then I also worked with an organisation in Victoria, Australia, which is one of the states there. And that was the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. And at that place of work, I really got into sort of this sort of, I suppose, the social justice, the sort of activist space, which looks at, I was working on a program called Fair Go Sport, which was looking at how do we create spaces at schools or at universities or in clubs which are inclusive for LGBT people. The research was showing categorically that those particular spaces, think about the cloakrooms or the locker rooms or whatever, were places of high stress. And for LGBT individuals, I think they're high stress for any weird 13-year-old teenager, or anyone for that matter. But that was exacerbated by, if you're starting to think around your gender identity or your sexual identity, you're going, well, this is
in those formative years.
And what we were finding was that youngsters were dropping out of sport, which was, had all sorts of health implications. It meant that they were missing a couple of really important life skills around what team sports could offer. So I spent a lot of time working and thinking around, working on how do we make those spaces inclusive. And it was fascinating because the work that we did, we worked with schools, and when we went into schools and young people worked with their teachers, worked with the principals and the school leadership, and it was great, but it was the young people leading the charge. They were adamant Australia. That they're friends. That was with Australia, yeah. And then And what do you mean, young people leading the charge? I think that it was the individuals that we were working with in those committees. So I was working at that point with high schoolers. So in Australia, that would be from 8th grade through 12th grade. They don't have a middle school system. Okay. So we were seeing 14, 15, 16-year-olds wanting to make sure that those spaces were safe and almost pushing their phys ed teachers or their school leadership into positions where it was more inclusive for all. Yeah. And being available in terms of like a therapy for these kids or access where they could talk about these things? Where was the interface with the kid? What was happening was that in that particular program, the work was around making sure that if there was no therapy or anything, but making sure that a young person who was coming into a space like that was able, like a locker room, for example, was able to, if they wanted to, have a space where they could get dressed or change out of their school uniforms into their phys ed uniforms, making sure that when games were played, particularly in the younger grades, that the games were inclusive for all genders. So you didn't have to be a boy to play soccer and a girl to play that. It was making sure that the teachers who were running those programs were thinking about the idea of, hold on a second, let's see what we can do to make sure that this game is, it doesn't matter who's playing. Now, just as a little kind of side note, the Boy Scouts of America, they're in a little bit of trouble these days, the Boy Scouts of America. Mm-hmm. Some say they might be headed for bankruptcy. We know that the LDS Church is leaving the Boy Scouts of America in another year or so, and that the LDS Church makes up about 70% of the Boy Scouts of America. But
they had a change of policy, which then allowed the girls to join the Boy Scouts of America. And I know that there were sort of some concerns on both sides of the issue and sort of piling everyone into one group or still keeping the separate groups. And, there's really not one answer for all. But I know that one of the things, the slight that I think the Girl Scouts in Utah felt is that they weren't doing the fun things that the Boy Scouts were doing. And so to me, it'll be interesting to see what scouting program or comes out of the church's development as they leave the Boy Scouts and go on their own.
I think that's going to be a fascinating thing to see. I think particularly if we're talking about the scouting program that the church might develop, I would hope that they have read and thought a little bit about what an inclusive scouting program looks like. And for the Boy Scouts of America and the Girl Scouts of America, I think that it is, there have been some incredible changes that are happening, but I'm excited to see what it means to a trans boy, a young transgender boy, being a member of the Boy Scouts, or a trans girl being a member of the Girl Scouts. Right. And I think that with those changes come some really exciting new developments and opportunities. I take your point about, what does it look like for them to be I suppose making sure that their activities are fun. And I think that, again, it requires, when you start to look at some of this research on gender and stuff, a competitive boy is as competitive as a competitive girl. There's no difference in that. And so when we start to think around some of the gender stereotypes that we have had for so many years because of where we live or how we've brought up with, we need to start thinking about the fact that, hold on a second, if I had to think about, I'm pretty
and it's nowhere more acutely presented than when you meet someone or come upon someone that's transgender.
Yeah.
Because it can present a bit of an awkward circumstance. No matter how liberal-minded you are, there's that hesitancy about how to be polite, how to best approach that person. And I think that we're kind of in the infant stages of learning how to deal with each other in that regard.
Mm-hmm. I think yes and no. I think we are in those infant stages. I think that for many people, my experience has been that most of the people that I work with or that I come into contact with want to do and say the right thing. And I think that anxiety comes from not that they don't want to meet a transgender person, but they just want to make sure that they are respectful and as respectful as they would be of
So I'm articulating a real phenomenon.
No. It absolutely is a real phenomenon. And I think that there are two things that really need to happen. I think that, one, we need to be meeting more transgender individuals, and I think that it's a wonderful opportunity when you do meet somebody who is a transgender individual or a gender non-conforming individual to sit down and politely say to them, I really want to say the right things. I want to be respectful. I'm not 100% sure how to do that. I will do some reading about this, or I will try to educate myself, but can you help me in understanding your pronouns, for example? So it is not at all a uncommon thing. We had a really fabulous conference a few weeks ago with the Young Presidents Organization. It was about 100 individuals who came into the Utah Pride Center. They're leaders and they're presidents of a variety of different businesses here in the Utah state. And one of the most popular groups that we had was Ask Me Anything. And it was a predominantly quite conservative group of wonderful individuals. And they were just there sitting, listening to a panel and being able to ask those questions that they feel awkward about asking. And what I saw at the end was this joy at being able to ask the question in a space that was not going to be judgmental or nobody was going to pounce on them, but they were able to ask those questions. And what that says to me is that people want to know more. They want to understand better. They want to do better. And I think that's exciting as someone who runs a space like I do, because too often we read a media report and somebody's blown up about X or Y, some cases justifiably and in some cases not. But I think that I still feel positive about the human race. We want to do the right things. We want to be respectful of people. We want to see people for who they are. We want to see them and help them enjoy and be their best selves.
And were you successful at that in downtown Salt Lake City these past few days?
You know, that thing is amazing. That Pride Festival, once it gets going, it just takes on a life of its own. And I think that that's exactly one of the points. I describe the festival as the executive director. Obviously, I have to describe it in terms of fundraising. So from a fundraising...
It comes down to the money.
Well, for me,
cover
it comes
the permit
down
costs?
to the money. We covered all the permit costs. For me, it does come down to the money because that's my job. I have to make sure that the centre stays open. For the community, it is a celebration. It is something joyous. It is something where they can go and where individuals can bring their colleagues or their friends or their schoolmates or their family, and they can be celebrated for that period of time. But I'll tell you something that's really interesting. I was in this job about, I want to say maybe 4 weeks, and my mental health team walked up to me and said, you have got to stop talking about this as a celebratory event, and you've got to stop talking about it as a fundraiser. From a mental health perspective, the youth, the Utah Pride Festival, our queer prom, which has 1,200 young people, are seen by those experts as suicide prevention spaces. They recognize the value in keeping of those spaces in keeping people alive because they see themselves for the first time. They see their identity reflected back at them. They see their identity celebrated, and they can access resources.
And how long have you been making that connection, or is that a more recent phenomenon where you've been making that connection between suicide prevention and this openness that you're articulating?
Yeah. I've been making that connection since my mental health team started shouting at me about it. But I think that for them, that's been a long-standing kind of acknowledged fact. And I think research again bears that out.
Saving lives.
It saves lives. It brings people into a space where they are able to understand that they are not alone. I think Utah can be, particularly rural Utah, can be an incredibly lonely place. And while they might not be in Salt Lake City, they might see that on the news, etc. I mean, yeah, I just hear
we're coming up on a commercial break. When we come back, we'll dive in back into the Utah Pride, your background, and more about Utah.
Yeah, cool.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to episode 32, Talk with Ted. I've got Rob Moolman. Am I saying that right?
Correct.
Interesting name, an Aussie sitting with me here. Are you a citizen?
I am a citizen of Australia. I'm actually originally South African.
South African.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, my family's South African and still there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Interesting place, South Africa. It's got some interesting history of its own.
Well, I think that history informs some of my thinking around what inclusive community centres should be and how hurtful and harmful discrimination and marginalisation can be because of how I grew up.
Yeah. It's really a divided place, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you've got money, you live in a gated community, a guarded, gated community. I think back to the Oscar Pistorius. The Blade Runner. Remember him, Alan?
Yeah.
The Blade Runner had great drama surrounding his life. And I think he's still in jail.
Yes.
The Blade Runner. You're a bit of a Blade Runner of your own, getting to Salt Lake City, Utah, and into the middle of sort of a big national cultural issue. It's Pride Month, June, right? Mm-hmm. April, I think, was Second Chance Month. What was May?
I don't know.
I'm not sure either.
I'm sure there would have been something.
Maybe Recovery Month. You know, we've been doing shows
Fabulous.
about drug and alcohol addiction and recovery and social pressures leading to those things. And it sounds like you're in a bit of the same business. And I know that there's probably some overlap with people struggling with their sexual identity and drug and alcohol abuse.
Yes, there is, very much.
What do you see in that realm?
I think that, as with anything, where you are feeling that you've been ostracized anyway, or you maybe are not feeling that, but have been physically kicked out of your home, or have been moved away from your family for coming out, I think that some people turn to drugs and alcohol. The Utah Pride Center has 3 different addiction recovery spaces and support systems, and we find that within the LGBTQ community, and again, a lot of the data will show that there are higher than usual rates of drug and alcohol addiction, and unfortunately in our community, very high rates of methamphetamine use.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that? What do you attribute that to? Or
I suppose I'd just go back to, I'd attribute that to that loss of connection. If you're feeling isolated, if you're feeling alone, I think that is one of the ways that some people use to cope. It might be alcohol, it might be drugs, but that comes from so many different spaces. It might be community-based, it might be family kind of disconnection. It might also just be the stress of not understanding what you're going through in your gender identity or your sexual identity, and I think that's sad.
And what's your story? Let's get to know Rob.
Oh dear.
How old are you, Rob?
I am 46 years old.
46.
Born and raised in South Africa. My whole family is still in South Africa.
Okay.
And then when I was about 36, I met a boy and in Vietnam. And he was an Australian expat who was working in Vietnam, and he moved back to Australia. And I thought, well, this sounds like fun. Let me go and see if that'll work out. And it has. And we've been together for we've been together for about 12 years. Interestingly, here's the interesting tidbit. I had to get married in Utah because when we moved here 3 years ago, it was not legal for 2 men to be married in Australia. So I went very nervously to the Utah County Courts, the county marriage office, and I had my camera ready because I've been watching television. I just moved here from Australia, and I'd been watching things like Kim Davis, etc. So I was really nervous about Utah. This was a red state. Sure,
in the Wild West.
I could not tell you the shock and sheer joy when I met those county marriage clerks or the marriage clerks, at how absolutely wonderful they were and how excited they were to be able to help Brad and I get married. And it was one of the most lovely days of my life.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Not what you were anticipating?
Not at all. No.
Not all stereotypes are true, are they?
Well, and amen to that, because I think that that's exactly how we operate. And we, until we are in a space, or until we have met individuals, and until we are connecting with people on a more human level, we, as strange human beings, default to the stereotype or to the box we expect something to be in. So yeah, it's been joyous. We initially came here for 3 years and have extended our contract and are staying for hopefully many more.
Good for you. Your contract with the center?
Beg your pardon. My partner's contract brought us here, so we moved here for his work.
Okay.
And then I was able to get this position at the center.
Oh, yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, awesome.
How does our culture compare to Australia here? Are we ahead of the game, behind?
In what way? What are you thinking?
Social acceptance.
That's an interesting one. I think that Australia has come a lot further, particularly in regards to LGBT and issues and the conversation. I say that having been acutely aware of having just told you that Utah had legalized marriage equality before Australia did.
Right.
However, socially, there is a far broader and far more far more consistent kind of acceptance of LGBT individuals. I think that scarily, in the time that I've been away, in the 3 years that I've been away, there has been that slight regression. A lot of that's been due to, again, some factions of political parties that are wanting to reel back the gains that have been made, not unlike what's happening here in the States. I think that Utah, to me, has been absolutely fascinating. I have gone back to Australia a number of times. I've told them about the Pride Festival. I've told them about the LGBTQ community in Salt Lake, and said I have never...
Huge, right?
Which is huge. I think our Pride Festival and Pride Parade, etc., is way bigger, certainly way bigger than the Melbourne one. But it is amazing. So I'll go back to Australia and I tell them what I find fascinating about the Utah culture is the focus on family. And that I know is a really important tenet of the LDS church and I think the American kind of culture around family first. And I think to myself, if we really just thought about that in a little bit of a more broader perspective, because what LGBT individuals are your family. They're your brothers and your sisters and your uncles and your aunts and your grannies and your grandparents who come out at different times, etc., but are still part of that weird thing we call a family. And I love it. But,
and why it became so strained here.
And it becomes so strained, yes.
And such conflict in that belief and that identity.
Yeah. And the sad part to me, in my understanding, is that as the I suppose the wards and the spaces and the towns are constituted, the family and the group, the church group or the church groups are so dominant. And once an individual is seen to be othered, they are moved and immediately cut off from that connection if they are asked to leave their home, or you don't just lose your family, you lose your friends, you lose your community, etc. So I think that to me is where I sit on that edge of, that's a really difficult place, because we try to pick up the pieces of those individuals who just have lost everything overnight.
And there's stories of suicides,
Yes.
young people that just have so much pressure and so much being ostracized by the community. And then probably ostracizing themselves a bit in their own head, because I think it's that lack of acceptance in the LGBT community is similar to that in the recovery and the addict community.
Yeah.
And there's often shame associated with being yourself, if you will.
Yes.
Right?
No, absolutely.
And I think there's a real danger in that. Where do you get most of your funding at the Pride Center? Is it donations? All donations?
No, well, we do three things. The Pride Festival is our largest fundraiser. We fundraise, we get about around $400,000 from the Pride Festival. So that's why I have been praying for a sunny day since January and been following the weather since January, because that impacts that.
Did it rain on it at all?
A little bit on the Saturday night.
The rainbow come out?
It came down in floods. Oh, there were rainbows everywhere.
Rainbows everywhere,
it was
right?
coming artificial or real.
Really?
It was happening. It came down. So our main act couldn't perform, and then luckily they agreed to perform on the Sunday. We get it. So to answer that question, we get our funding from our events that we throw, mainly the Pride Festival. We then also rely on donors and grants. We do a lot of work trying to secure grant funding from different foundations. And we've been more and more successful at that as we've been able to show more and more success in our own work and our own programs. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
One of the things you mentioned there was around suicide. I just wanted to add that, we're focusing currently on the suicide problems of youth, because that's been the predominant kind of message and stories in our press. And I think that we should never lose focus of the stories of those suicides.
Up 50% since 1999.
Yes. We're seeing a little bit of an improvement this year. I spoke to Senator Thatcher the other day, and he was saying that we're seeing a little bit of a downward trend in that. But I do want to tell you that one of the surprises to me has been the suicide rate in our senior LGBT community. It is significantly higher, would you believe this, than the youth population.
Really?
So people over 50, the suicide rate is, depending on which demographic you look at, but across those demographics, significantly higher than the youth population. And that, again, has to deal with that social isolation. Okay. Those individuals who are 50, 60 plus suffered through the AIDS crisis. They were kicked out of their families in the 70s and 80s. I'm stereotyping, generalizing, I beg your pardon. They were kicked out of their families in the 70s and 80s for being gay, because it was such a taboo at that point. They then lost all of their friends and their social connectors through the AIDS crisis, and they're now sitting in their 60s and 70s alone at home, disconnected. And it's one of the new programs that we have is called SAGE, or our Senior Advocacy for Gay Elders. And it's been some of the most rewarding work and inclusion that we're seeing at the center, is people finally going, oh my goodness, I can meet new people, get connected again. Sorry, I took you off track there. I wanted to add to that because
there's so many places to go. You know, one of the things is age. It's interesting you mentioned that, because back when I was growing up, I got you by a few years. I'm 52.
A little bit.
So I was growing up in the 80s, the great 80s, the Larry Bird years. And
do you mean the Madonna Material Girl?
Yeah, Madonna Material Girl. And it was when I was in college, it was the AIDS epidemic in the mid to late 80s. And of course, then Magic Johnson, the great basketball player, came out in 1991, I think, or November of 1990. 91, you're right. And then and indicated that he was HIV positive, and of course millions died. There was trouble getting the right drugs to people. You don't hear as much these days in the news. Maybe I haven't been paying enough attention. About the AIDS epidemic, and I know that there are medications available more widely. I think about 2/3 of the people in the world that have AIDS have access to those medications. But where do we stand with AIDS and the fight on AIDS and its effect on the community?
Yeah, I think you've raised an important point. I think that there are two things. Number one, AIDS is still around. I think that we have sort of stopped talking about it as much as we probably should be talking about it. But number two, the improvements and in the science and the medicine behind treating individuals who have HIV and around prevention of HIV have increased in leaps and bounds. We know that since the early 90s.
Medicine's just keeping people alive.
Medicine's, well, two things.
It's not
Medicine's
curing
not only keeping people alive, it's not curing it, but it's getting and I speak as a non-HIV expert here, so I will tell you one thing. It is with the current medicine, it's getting people's viral load down to a point at which point it is termed in the medical world undetectable. And once somebody is undetectable, they can be having unprotected sex with another partner, and that virus cannot be transmitted. So in the early 80s and 90s, that wasn't around. People,
Sure.
the virus was in the high viral load. It was being transmitted far more easily. But the Utah AIDS Foundation, I've just done a campaign with them, which is, and you'll see U equals U, which means undetectable equals untransferable, which is a really important thing. And then, of course, we have the new medication called PrEP, which pre-exposure prophylaxis, which if you're taking it regularly, it prevents you from contracting HIV, which we did not have in the 1980s.
Gains in science.
Yeah.
Top of the hour, we've got the national commercial break. We'll be right back with Hour 2 Talk. Welcome back to Hour 2 of Talk with Ted, a show about nothing, number 32, Matt. Rob, hopefully you're not offended, a show about nothing.
No, not so much.
I don't really know what the show's about. It's about pop culture, law, talk radio, just really trying to keep some dialogue going between people.
Good.
My daughter asks me, what's the radio show about? And I tell her that I interview good people doing good things. Good. So you're on that list of hours.
Thank you.
If that's anything, the accomplishment of the day.
Yep. I think it pretty much might be.
And one thing that I'm a big basketball fan, and I like to relate things to the Utah Jazz and to basketball. And we were talking a little bit in the first hour about Magic Johnson, the legend Magic Johnson. And, he played in a national championship game that took place here in Salt Lake City at the Huntsman Center in 1979. Still the most watched college basketball game in history, 35 million people. I watched it from my living room back in New York. But Magic Johnson was one of my idols in the 80s, the great basketball star. And then I came here, in the late 80s and 90s, and I would come on ski vacation, and I would often go to the Jazz games and root against Karl Malone. I wasn't a Jazz fan because I got tired of Karl Malone beating our brains out every year. And the Knicks and the Jazz have in common defeat at the hands of Michael Jordan. And so that's what I share with my Utah fans here. But back when Magic Johnson, I was in law school when that happened, when he announced that he had AIDS. And there was some rumor that he was homosexual. He's denied that, and first indicated he didn't know how he had gotten AIDS, and then later indicated that it was from promiscuity, basically from a lifestyle as an NBA player. But he's been in basically good health since then. But back, he announced that he discovered that he had AIDS from a routine physical to start the 91-92 season, and he announced it in November of 1991 that he would be retiring. They brought him back to play in the All-Star game that February. I remember it well. And he lit him up. He scored 25 points and was the star of the game, including the last-second shot. But his return, then also on the Dream Team in 1992, but his return to basketball was met with some reluctance and some apprehension on the part of people regarding their understanding of HIV and whether it could be whether you could acquire it from physical contact like basketball. And Karl Malone was outspoken about it back at the time. And it's interesting to go back. This is 1992, 27 years ago. And we've come a long way in 27 years. But Karl Malone was outspoken at the time about being fearful of being able to acquire the disease from Magic Johnson through the contact sport. And Magic Johnson wanted to make a statement back then because he felt, believed, and knew that he didn't pose any risk to anyone. There was some, and I don't mean to single out Karl Malone. I love Karl Malone. I bought 2 cars from him. From his dealership out in Heber. I ask if he's there every time I'm there. One of these days I'm going to get Karl Malone on a phone. But there were others that felt the same way too. And we're all, a product of our times, and it's easy to look back and with 20/20 hindsight and to see things more clearly. But I point this out because it wasn't that long ago that we had that in the sort of the mass media that HIV issue was at the forefront of basketball. It's now we're talking about broader issues with respect to lesbian, gay, bi, transgender rights, and really the psychological impact of living in the modern world while being a little bit different.
Absolutely. I think, I'm not going to use Magic Johnson as my example, but there were many other things that I remember from the 90s. I remember Greg Louganis hitting his head on the diving board.
Oh, sure. The diver.
Yeah, the diver. I also remember Princess Diana, very controversially at the time, going into HIV wards in London and sitting and touching people. And that was the first time a public figure was out sitting in a hospital with individuals and touching them. And it rocked certainly the communities that I was living in at the time around a better understanding of how the infection is transmitted. But I think that we are in a different time. I think that, the HIV crisis was devastating to this community, particularly the gay male community, but devastating to the LGBT community as a whole. We've got our local heroes here. I don't know if you've been watching or if you've had the opportunity, and I would urge any listener to take up the opportunity to watch a movie called Quiet Heroes. It is about Dr. Kristen Reese and Maggie Snyder. It recently won, it's a documentary, it recently won an Emmy Award, produced right here in Utah. And Dr. Kristen Reese was the only doctor in Utah who would see HIV positive patients.
To give the medicine.
To sit with them, treat them, help them.
And you're talking early 90s?
Early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. Senator Jim DeBacchus tells the incredibly emotional story about carrying his friend from doctor to doctor and being turned away at the door, and eventually ending up on Dr. Reese's at Dr. Reese and the Sisters of the Holy Cross Convent Hospital in that space. Please watch that movie. It is incredible. It's called
say it again.
It's called Quiet Heroes. I believe it's on Hulu and it might be on Netflix at the moment. It is an incredible movie to watch about these 2 women and the nuns from the Holy Cross Convent and the work that they did in saving people's lives or being there when they had at their lowest or had been rejected by their families. So that is not that long ago. I saw Dr. Reese and Maggie Snyder were in the tent at Pride.
Really?
Yeah, the community. We have the Dr. Reese Community Service Award, and that is the highest honor you can achieve I believe, in this community in Utah, in the LGBT community, for the community service work. And we recently, at the Pride Center, we were able to help facilitate the handing out of that award. And this year we had 2 amazing individuals who received that for their community work. And again, it's changed. You talk about, being a product of your time, whatever. I'm really glad that I am of this time, that I've seen that change, that I've lived through the kind of change in discourse, the change in thinking, the change in how we are perceiving individuals who are different. I think it's wonderful.
Are you ever not working?
No.
You're always working, aren't you?
Always working. You have to. I think that
I've got a cousin who's a magician.
Yeah.
And I've got him figured out because he's always got it turned on. He's always got the magic turned on. You've always got the cause turned on, don't you?
You have to have. I think that
You live it.
Yeah, I think one of the things about working, this is the LGBT space, but I could be one of 1,000 other executive directors that you interview who would have the same passion for the work that they do, and the constant feeling of you're not doing enough because there is so much more work to do. There is work to help LGBT parents. There is work to help LGBT kids at schools. There is work to help children of LGBT parents. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, good for you. And is that what keeps you going, that burning desire?
I think it does, and I think
you're still young enough. You're not burnt out yet.
Thank you so much. I think this job's making me older. I certainly didn't have the grey hair when I started, but I think that yes, it does keep me going, and I think that the other thing that keeps me going is being in a space, again, with individuals who are constantly driving me to be better or to think better. We spoke a little bit earlier about understandings of gender and that nervousness that you have when you meet a person who might be a trans man or whatever the example might be. I am in this space and I feel some of that anxiety, and I love that I'm learning something new every day and that I'm being inspired by individuals who I work with to do more and be better. And again, I speak from my position, but I also know that there are the individuals who I've met at the VOA or the Planned Parenthood or
let's call out 1 or 2 of them at work at the Utah Pride Center. Let's give some credits to some people that you work with. Tell us a story about somebody doing something good.
I have to tell you that I think that I'm horribly biased because my background is in teaching, but one of the things that I'm really proud that we're doing work in is schools. And we interviewed and hired about a year ago now an amazing individual who has come in. They're gender diverse. They use they, them pronouns, and they move in through the school system and are working with high school and high school GSAs. We've got a few middle school clubs that are sort of in all but name a GSA, and they are doing incredible work in connecting young people with each other across schools and within the schools, and helping teachers better understand their LGBT students, but also helping teachers understand the need to recognize those individuals. We know, again, research is showing that even if a school just has a GSA or a gay-straight alliance at the school, the rates of suicide and absenteeism decrease amongst LGBT students. That alone.
Its existence.
You don't even, if you're an LGBT kid, you don't even have to be going to the GSA to experience those effects. Just the existence of it is creating, and again, it's not just one report, it's not just one weird academic somewhere. That is constantly being turned up all over the place.
Now, we're in Utah, and you mentioned school, and we're talking sexuality. Do you have, what kind of access do you have to the public schools or to provide these resources, and is there any resistance?
Well, you started the sentence with "we're in Utah," so yes, we do have resistance, and some schools are far more open to this discussion. I'll tell you one of the interesting stories that I had was I jumped up and down the same person who I was talking about a few minutes ago. They'd been working at the center, say, for 6 months, and I walked down into their office and I said, "Hey, I need a list of all the GSAs that are in Utah." And they looked at me and they said, "Well, that's not going to happen." I said, "Well, why not? You've been here for 6 months. What's happening?" And they said, "You know what? How we collect this data, because it is so secret, we'll find some schools will have them. But then when we have an event like Queer Prom or we have some sort of social event, we go to students who are new and say, 'Hey, where are you from?' And they say, 'I'm from school X.' and we'll ask them, do you have a GSA? And they say, yeah, we do, but we can't tell anyone. It's called the Geography Club, or it's called the Poetry Club, or the English Literature Club, or something like that. So so it's really difficult.
It's underground?
It's underground. It's difficult for us to get access to it, the students
underground.
will not be public or open about it because the school might not allow it. Yeah.
The other GSA. Tell me again.
GSA, gay, it's either a gay straight alliance. Many of them have different names, but the common name is the GSA. It's just over 20 years since East High had the East High walkout, when the whole school walked out because they couldn't have a GSA at the school, and that lawsuit was settled 20 years ago. We had all the original plaintiffs come to us, a discussion with the ACLU and the lawyers who pressed that case. But
very cool.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And the other
that
problem
high school
is
was known for High School Musical as well.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's just near where I live. Yeah. The other problem is that one of the rules and the rules that we have in place in the school system is that parents need to sign permission slips for young people to go and be part of a club. What young person who doesn't understand what's happening with them is going to want to go to dad and say, hey, I really want to go and find out about my gender or sexuality. Yeah, please, will you sign this document?
In general.
Yeah, it's sexuality in general. I want to go and talk to somebody about the fact that I'm feeling things for this boy or this girl, or so to get into any club, you need a parental signature. My 11-year-old
daughter doesn't want to tell me she has a crush on any boys.
Oh, well, there you go.
She wants to deny that. Then I hear from her friends or I see in her books that she has a crush on every boy she sees.
Yes. Oh, well, there you go.
Right? So, but she doesn't want to tell me.
Yeah. Yeah. And now imagine if she has to get a signature from you to go to talk to somebody or be part of a club or whatever. Yeah. It's completely prohibitive.
The difficult issues, growing up, coming of age, and that gray area that we all pass through. Yeah. Stay tuned. We're up against a commercial break. We'll be right back with another segment of Talk with Ted, a show about nothing. Welcome back to Talk with Ted, a show about nothing. It's drive time on Tuesday, June 4th, 2019. It's 5:23. Absolutely beautiful out there. Look out for the motorcycles. The motorcycles come out this time of year. It's been rainy and not great. There haven't been a ton of bikes on the road. But the motorcycles are out. And I think Utah is a very tempting place to ride a motorcycle, but a very dangerous place to ride a motorcycle. The grid down here in the valley, you just never know when someone's going to run that red light or not stop behind you. But if you can get out on the open road in Utah on a motorcycle, that's some good open air fun. So look out for the bikes because they're out there. Any bikers at the Pride Festival?
Of course there were.
You always got the support of the bikers are always supporting.
Well, traditionally, every single Pride Festival in the world, or every single Pride parade across the world, gets opened with the Dykes on Bikes. And they are...
The what bikes?
The Dykes.
Dykes and bikes.
Dykes on Bikes.
Dykes on Bikes.
And they open every single Pride parade across the world. We do it in Melbourne, we do it in South Africa, we do it here. And that has come from years and years of amazing and strange LGBT history, but their role has always been to clear the path. Lesbian individuals have for many years cleared our path.
Lesbian bikers.
There's
something about a bike gang.
It's pretty cool when those bikes started on Sunday. It was amazing that you just hear that roar and
you get
the crowd goes mad.
They got each other's back. You ride as a pack. It's a little safer than it is out there, and the bikers got each other's backs.
Absolutely.
And you see them getting involved in great things for child trafficking, drug awareness. So it doesn't surprise me that the bikers are involved in the Pride Festival. What was the highlight for you of the Utah Pride Festival?
I think one of the highlights for me has always been every festival that I go to, but for this one in particular, was seeing the number of young people that were there. And hearing some of the stories about how many people had been there or had come for the first time, that this was something that they never wanted to. And the newbies love it. There is something just joyous about coming into a space, particularly when I imagine, I'd have to think years back now, but, that anxiety of stepping into the space or stepping into somewhere that is that you've wanted to be in or that you want to know more about, and then realizing what joy there is at the Pride Festival. It was
now historically we are in Utah.
Yes,
right? A couple of years ago, I was in Provincetown, Cape Cod.
Yeah.
which is an interesting place because it's all the way out on the tip.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got its own history
Yes.
in American gay and homosexual culture because it was sort of where they escaped to,
Yeah.
all the way the tip of Cape Cod. And it can, in recent years, I think it has become kind of a show of its own, if you will. And I think that sometimes there's concern of people with some of these festivals that they get too over the top or maybe too hyper-sexualized. Is that making any sense? And and where did the Pride Festival, Salt Lake's festival, rank in using that as the barometer?
I think what's interesting about Salt Lake's festival is how family-focused and family-friendly it is. Having said that, we've got a number of different groups that are or would be perhaps conceived or considered to be more extreme or out there. But at the heart of that
Were there
point,
any protesters against you?
There were. I'll tell you. I'll
we
talk
can
about
get
those
to that
protests in a
next.
second.
Okay.
But at the heart of that point is the current kind of well, it's not current at all. It's the age-old situation of the LGBT movement is to liberate or to assimilate. So do we assimilate and do we strive to be like?
Can you do both?
Can you do both? Yes. Do you strive to be like everybody else and have the picket fence with the 2 dogs and the cat and the children? And is that the goal of the movement? Or is the movement, and has the movement always been a liberation movement, talking about different ways of sexuality, different ways of relationships? So that is always going to sit at the heart of it. And so that, again, depending on where you are in the country, you're going to find festivals moving
Or
to
along
one
the
side
parade
or the
route,
other.
perhaps?
Yes.
Right, because there's always a bit of that.
Yeah. And it's always a bit of fun. I think that we do it so well here in Utah. We had drag queens, we had members of the leather and the kink community, we had Mormons building bridges behind them, we had families, then we had,
Hold on, you
yeah.
threw me. You had the kinky group and then the Mormons building bridges.
Yes.
What is that?
Mormons Building Bridges is a fabulous group started by Erica Munson and one other individual whose name completely escapes me, and I apologize for that. But they are a group of Mormon individuals who still go to church. They they might have young people who are LGBT or not, or young people or family members or not, but their focus was to reach across the divide that sits between the LDS Church and the LGBTQ community. And so Erica, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, forgive me if I'm getting all of the actual detail wrong, but decided a few years ago that she wanted to march in Pride with a banner that said, "Mormons, we want to build this bridge." And she put a text out and sent out a Facebook request to anybody who wanted to walk with her. And before she knew it, she had 400 people walking with her. So they're a fantastic contingent.
When was that for the first time?
You're gonna please don't hold me to this. I want to say it was about 4 years ago.
You're new to town.
They also had an amazing float, which they had in the Provo Pride Parade. Remember when there was that situation when the Provo, beg your pardon, not the Provo Pride, the Provo
Tabernacle?
What's it?
Was it Tabernacle?
No, they had the Provo Parade. Is it the Days of 47 parade down in Provo?
Days of 47.
Yeah, they have the big parade down there. And then last year and the year before, they said no LGBT groups whatsoever. And then last year they kind of got permission for some LGBT groups, and then at the last minute, the organizers said absolutely not, because we are celebrating the military and our veterans. And Erica and the Mormons Building Bridges had this enormous, wonderful float, which was about LGBT veterans and recognizing that there were a number of people who served who were LGBT at the time and who are now. So Erica's float was the one that was allowed into that parade, or the Mormons Building Bridges float was allowed into that parade. And she brought it up to Salt Lake, and they were in our parade on Sunday. It was amazing. Awesome. It was a great float, just recognizing individuals with huge, big photos of veterans who are out or have been out as LGBT and as a serving member of the military.
And that's got, both of those issues have connection to the history, the Pride event in Salt Lake City. I'm lifting this from City Weekly, but in 1977, as this festival was being organized, the Salt Lake Coalition for Human Rights celebrates Gay Freedom Day with a 3-day symposium. Organizers bring in Air Force Sergeant Leonard Matlovich as keynote speaker, the first openly gay person on the cover of Time or any other U.S. magazine, and an ex-Mormon. But maybe now we're getting to a point where we've got some of these people in that community that aren't ex-Mormon, and we have.
That's correct.
I opened the show talking about the recent valedictorian at BYU, and BYU's been in the news with respect to the honor code and its effectiveness, whether it's being used in the best way to benefit the kids it's designed to benefit, rather than being sort of putative or punishing. And so those things have been in the news, and I understand that this gentleman from BYU was in the parade.
Yes, he was. He was actually standing on the Utah Pride Center float right behind me. It was hilarious. Matt Easton is his name.
Easton?
Yes. So we invited Matt. He came to our Pride Spectacular, which is our big center gala, about 2 weeks ago. And when he got up onto the stage with other young individuals, Savannah Schuyler, Amir Fanian.
And who are they?
Savannah Schuyler is the young girl who 2 years ago was coming out in her church at the pulpit, and the person at the church switched the microphone off. She was 13 years old at the time, and she was coming out and speaking her truth to her church community, and as being a young lesbian girl, and her microphone was cut off. So she, in cutting off the microphone, they gave her a far bigger voice, because she's now traveling around the country as an HRC youth ambassador. She's 15 years old. Ermia Fanian is a trans young woman of color, who's studying up at the university. She started March for Our Lives. So we have these incredible individuals come up onto the stage, and I'll tell you that when Matt Easton stood up there in a room full of 770 people, there was not a dry eye in the house, because so many of those people who were there have either gone to BYU, have been members of the LDS Church, and they recognize the impact and the power of what he did. And it was incredible. So Matt was on the...
And I would add to that, and to give the university a little credit, what the university allowed him to do.
Yes, that's correct.
Because I think that was probably had to be as much a relief to some of those struggling with those internal problems. Then if he had gotten up there and went rogue and didn't have the university's permission and did it off the top of his head.
Absolutely. And I spoke to Matt about that, and he was decidedly anxious about turning in that speech, and thought it was going to come back with a tremendous amount of edits. And he credits that university leadership team for allowing him to do that on stage. So, yeah, it was amazing.
We've come a long way.
We have come a long way. It was quite hilarious standing on that float, and I was in front of him, and he was standing right behind me, and I'd be waving frantically, and I'd watch people wave at me, and then their eyes would move to Matt, and they'd look at him, and then they'd whisper to their friend, and they'd look at him again, and they'd point, and they would just start screaming. It was amazing. He's a bit of a rock star at the moment.
I was going to say, to have that kind of influence at 24 years old has got to be really something special.
He's the Grand Marshal of the DC Pride event as well, so he's flying to DC to go and...
Really?
Yeah. So that kind of...
Right out of the Utah battleground.
Right out of BYU, because people recognize the steps that are being taken here. Utah stays, and I think my understanding of the history is that Utah is a unique place in that the battleground, if you want to use that metaphor, the battle lines are clearly drawn, and it's wonderful to see when those, you can see the movement forward and backwards and forward and backwards. And when
we're talking about relationships,
you absolutely
if you take away the politics, the religion, and the sexuality, and make us strip us all down to just some abstract human, you're talking about relationships and deep-seated relationships that are at the core of people's individual security.
Absolutely. And connection. I mean, those two things go hand in hand. And I think that...
Utah's a unique place. I've said it so many times. It's like an island here.
Yeah.
There's not another city that you can drive to real quickly. It's 6 hours of desert in every direction.
Yeah.
And I think culturally, it can be kind of confining for some people, especially if you grow up here.
Yeah. No, I imagine it can be. And there was an article in one of the papers yesterday about an individual who'd grown up here and who'd come to Pride when they were 18 years old, and they've returned 20 years later or 30 years later. and they just cannot believe that it's the same city.
Salt Lake City.
Yeah, that's it.
I've been here about 22 years. Salt Lake City. Are we on there? Is that my mic?
Yeah.
But it's a different Utah than even the pre-Olympic. The 2002 Utah. Those Olympics really changed this place.
Yeah.
It was a couple of years after the Olympics that the real development and migration to Utah started, and there's a lot of great things here. I'm sure you've familiarized yourself with our natural wonders in this state.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that Utah, for me, has become home very quickly, and I felt more connected with this LGBT community and some of my neighbors, etc., than I have in many of the other places that I've lived with. It's quite a unique space.
And people back east would be surprised to learn that Salt Lake City is a very gay community. It's got a very high population, gay population, right?
It's a pretty queer place. Yeah, I'm telling you that. Particularly considering the number of people that I saw out.
It's got a lot of tattoo
Friday
parlors
and Saturday.
too.
There are a few tattoo parlors. Tattoos are not necessarily for just the LGBT community.
No, I didn't imply it.
But it is. I think that's something which Salt Lake is trying to tell the rest of the world, and I think we're seeing that through some national articles that are going out. You were talking about the post-Olympics, but I often get called by some of the major companies down in Lehigh, on Silicon Slopes and that sort of space, to try to come in and tell their new employees, hey, there are gay people here, and there's a huge big pride festival, and that it is okay to move here, because there is still that
You're
anxiety.
working with corporate America in that regard?
Of course we do. Yeah, we have to. We've got an incredible education and training unit that's going out to try and, first of all, help companies become more aware of inclusive language or inclusive policies, etc., because those companies know that in order to attract top talent, which we're seeing now down in Provo and Lehigh, and they have to be LGBT inclusive. They have to try to attract a diverse pool of talent. And people coming from the coasts want to know that it's a safe space to come to.
Because there's a lot of people come from the coasts.
Well, I don't know.
Right?
I'm seeing a lot of
I've
of
seen
people
it.
coming in here.
A lot of people have moved to Utah
Yeah.
over the last X number of years. When I moved here, the population was 2 million. Now it's over 3 million.
Yeah.
So it's a demographically changed place.
Yeah.
And it's a very diverse place.
Absolutely.
It's a real diverse city. It's still not portrayed that way nationally. And I attribute part of that to our minority population isn't necessarily African Americans.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of brown people and Asian people and refugees from around the world. And it's not all LDS Mormon culture exclusively like it used to be, I suppose, back in 1847 when they first got here and nobody else was here.
Right. I think the important point that you make there is that around the idea of diversity. And I think one of the things that we're working on particularly hard is to try to create a better understanding of what is of diversity as opposed to inclusion. Because yes, a space can be diverse and we can have a number of different ethnicities or religions in the space, and that's a diverse space. But until you're actually listening to those voices, or until you're allowing those diverse individuals to be at the same table speaking instead of just in the room, that then becomes inclusion. And I think that that's the next step where we're starting to want to see happen here, is that step from, we've got a lot of different people here is one thing, but are we listening to any of them? Is it just still one particular group or one particular voice that is dominant over the whole thing? And how are we including different voices and diverse perspectives?
Up against the final commercial break. Stay tuned. We'll be back for the final segment of Talk with Ted with Rob Moolman, Utah Pride Center. Welcome back to Talk with Ted, number 32. It's 5:43 drive time on Tuesday, June 4th, 2019. And I've got with me Rob Moolman, Utah Pride, and we've been having a good conversation about basically the history of the movement here in Utah. And we've got an imported executive director at Utah Pride Center from South Africa, and we've been poking around a number of issues, the effect of coming of age and discovering your sexual orientation, during your formative years, if that's the case, can be challenging for young people, maybe contributing to some mental health issues. And Rob's been talking about suicide prevention and other benefits of programs that are offered through the Utah Pride Center. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
You were talking about educating some companies here in Silicon Slopes and the need for these high-tech companies for their human resource departments to kind of mold to the new reality, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's just kind of amazing that those are the types of things that you're doing. It's really kind of on the forefront. As well as you spoke about therapy. And is there therapy offered for people in the LGBT community at the center itself?
There's a tremendous amount of therapy that's offered. It is affirming therapy. It understands, it also comes from years and years of work in this space. One of the things that, just to talk politics for a second, that was most frightening to us was the legislature's rejection of the conversion therapy bill, because we at the center spend a lot of time talking to individuals who have undergone conversion therapy.
Okay, when you say conversion, damage. What is conversion therapy? Conversion
therapy is an outdated and non-peer-reviewed, it's not even endorsed by any psychiatric or psychological association or guild. And it's the idea that you could take your child or take yourself to a therapist and they could de-gay you or de-lesbian you.
Deprogram you.
And
that's been an issue here in Utah for a number of years.
It's been an issue for a number of years. There were some horror stories. The amazing Equality Utah led that bill, and we thought that it was going to get passed. But at the last minute, the Eagle Forum came in and nixed the bill. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry.
You're fine.
Yeah. So, we do a lot of work in that space around making sure that individuals who come to the Pride Center or who seek help are able to do so in a way that is going to see them first. One of the other interesting programs that we have, and we're the only one in the country, or that we know of at the moment, there might be one other new one, outside of California, I beg your pardon, is a survivors of suicide attempt program. So we know that the leading indicator of a successfully completed suicide is having tried it in the past, and we have an LGBTQ-focused survivor of suicide program that has been peer-reviewed, that we do a tremendous amount of work on, and to speak to the suicide, for lack of a better term, epidemic that is raging through Utah at the moment.
That's amazing.
Yep.
And I think the public at large doesn't really know this. It's much more than planning a party.
Yeah, it is. Much more. The party is
gets a lot
just
of
the
attention.
fundraiser. The party is what gets us a bit of attention, but the party brings us the funds and brings us the community to understand our programming, but also to help keep our doors open to really connect with individuals who need our help.
Okay. In a broader question, here in Utah, it's really the collision, if you will, of these religious beliefs and principles, and speaking in sort of moral terms and moral decisions, and the effect that can have on people locally that are in that environment. And do you see any reconciliation, if you will, between the two communities, not the LDS community, but just religion at large? Can it coexist with the LGBT community, or is it at odds? Religious rights and religious groups. Can you speak to that a little bit, including the protesters that you had at the festival?
Absolutely. Again, I'll put the protesters off for a second, but let me talk about that religious experience, the religious and the faith communities. One of the events that leads into the Utah Pride Festival is the interfaith service, and we have an interfaith service and have had for many, many years on the Thursday before Pride kicks off. There would have been about 30 different faith organizations at that event. It was hosted at the Methodist Church. And the Methodist Church itself is undergoing a really interesting situation around LGBT individuals and LGBT inclusive practices. We had the first openly lesbian bishop fly in from Denver to come and speak at the Utah Interfaith Service. And there were hundreds of people, and there were religions. There was Jewish religions, there were Buddhism, there was a variety of different Christian religions.
Mormon?
All of there. I know that Mormons Building Bridges were there, and some of those individuals there. So there were LDS people in the congregation. There were definitely LDS people in the congregation, but they weren't in the clergy, the queer clergy leadership, as we were calling it at that point. And I think that one of the really sad things is this discourse that's created in our culture or in the media that you can only be LGBT or you can be religious, because that is just not true. When you see, when you go to events like this and you see churches and faith communities reaching across and saying, we want to be more inclusive and we want you as part of that. I think that there has been, for lack of a better term, a coming to God moment in many of those churches where they realize the harm that they have caused. And I think that's the hurdle for churches that are currently excluding LGBT individuals. You've got to first recognize that there has been harm caused, and you've got to acknowledge that harm. Much like, as you know, if we were talking earlier around addiction,
as well intentioned as it may have been.
Yes, yeah, as well intentioned as it may have been. And I think that the thing for me, there were two things that I suppose got me through my religious sort of crisis of faith. One was I was living in South Africa, and the most important clergyman in South Africa, and in fact in certainly most of the world through the 90s, was a Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was the Archbishop of Cape Town, and he very publicly said this was the most important man of God in the country, who publicly stood up and said, I'm going to get this quote horribly wrong, but if I go to heaven and find out that it's homophobic, I prefer to go to the other place. I don't want to be in a space where there is I don't want to know that there is a homophobic God. And I suddenly had this kind of epiphany of like, oh my goodness, if this man of God is saying that I am important, I can start to reconcile this idea of being a person of faith and a member of the LGBTQ community. And then the other thing was just a simple song we sang at school at the time and it was about, it was one, and I apologize, I'm going to be terrible, I can't remember the exact verse, but it was when Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. And if you live by this, then everyone will know that you're one of my disciples. And that was it. And nothing else mattered. The texts from Deuteronomy or Leviticus or whatever gets used to clobber gay people over the head became completely irrelevant. They were in the Old Testament. The only thing Jesus said about love, well, not the only thing he said about love, there were lots of things he said about love, but the thing that spoke to me about his love was, if you love others, that's the commandment I give to you. And it's not if you love them just if they're straight.
Isn't that the ultimate? Isn't that the ultimate
commandment? That is
the
thing. That is the commandment.
And mustn't that start with loving yourself?
Absolutely.
Because how can you love anyone else if you don't love yourself?
You realize you're quoting RuPaul.
No, not Paul Rand.
Unintentionally.
RuPaul?
Unintentionally. So no.
Citing some 80 lyrics here?
No. There's obviously it's a quote from somewhere else, but at the end of every RuPaul's Drag Race, every single show, she finishes her show. A very famous drag queen. She finishes herself by saying, finishes the show off by saying, "How are you going to love somebody else if you can't love yourself?" Yeah. And then she says, "Can I get an amen?"
Yeah. Well, awesome. there you go.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So it's this dichotomy of you're a person of faith or not is ridiculous. However, again, we see that historical hurt and harm and structural discrimination that happened has caused a lot of hurt. We have the Pride Center is doing a lot of work in trying to bring this together. We have, not only do we do the interfaith service, we've got Pastor Curtis coming in from one of the Baptist churches. We're connecting with the Jewish community. And Pastor Curtis came to us and said, I want to try and help in a non-denominational way. He is a pastor who sits at our center on generally a Tuesday afternoon, and he just listens. If somebody wants to come and rage at him about the damage that religion has done to them, he sits and listens. If they want to pray with him, he sits and prays with them. If they want to go through the texts, he goes through the text and just talks to them about different interpretations. So, again, much like everything else, it is about connecting and building the relationships and having that relationship with somebody who understands that love is love is love is love.
And I just think that here in Utah, that's got to be one of the hardest things to separate. I've said it a few times here, but that personal identity that you're discovering maybe as a young person or that as an adult, and those religious standards that you're part of, and the great internal conflict that causes, and how is best to address that, because we see these things manifested. These problems are real. The suicides are real. There was a number of stories last year about suicides here in Utah and in Harriman, Utah. I think one high school had 4 of them. I think one of the problems that we have as a society is reporting suicides. Because it's a real problem reporting suicides, because there's part of it that we don't want to report, right? And it's often only the most highly publicized ones that get reported. But maybe even how we deal with suicide reporting is a little bit awkward as well.
Absolutely.
Hopefully, we'll be dealing with fewer of them. But I gotta believe, Robin, it's kind of all coming to fruition. The modern world that we live in, the pressures that the kids face, and the way that they can antagonize one another on Facebook and in social media, but these things have also opened up avenues of discussion and different perspectives and new treatment options and alternatives. And it sounds like Utah Pride is sort of leading the way in a number of those fronts.
I hope so. I mean, there's a lot of work for us still to do. I think about we spoke about the conversion therapy bill. We need leadership to step up. We're looking at some of the rolling back of rights and opportunities for transgender individuals. So this fight keeps going. The transgender, no trans members of the military, the ban on serving as a trans member. I think that there is a tremendous amount of work still to do, and it keeps me up at night. It keeps me inspired. But it ultimately does come down to the fact that once we start to see individuals for who they are and recognize that they are going through the same, or they are also going through all sorts of strange things in their lives.
There's only so many basic storylines, isn't that right?
Yes, only so many.
There's only so many storylines,
and
before everyone's becomes kind of
the
similar.
same thing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
The same is true among people that struggle with addictions.
Yes.
They've got a very similar storyline.
Yeah.
Shame is a big part.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I think that
I think that shame comes from spaces, unfortunately comes from spaces where people should feel safest. And to go back to that religious point of view, if you're sitting in a church where you should feel the most safe, if you're a person of a spiritual or a person of faith, and you are either being told that your existence is somehow abhorrent, or it's being intimated by, we're not actually even going to talk about you, or not we're going to mention your sexuality or your gender, or we're going to actively discriminate against you. That shame is exacerbated, because that's where you should feel most comforted.
And then where do you go?
Where do you
Absolutely.
go? Absolutely.
You go to the dark parts of your mind where you don't live up to those standards.
That's
and
it.
You fear the future and regret the past and forget who you are, perhaps, in the process.
Yeah.
It's amazing that out there in the real world, I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for 25 years in the negligence and judgment business. And when you go to law school, you learn how to be judgmental.
Yep.
And it's terrible. It happened to me my first year of law school. But they teach you how to be judgmental, and that's why first-year law students are kind of obnoxious, because they think they got it figured out, what's reasonable, what's not, and you think you got all the answers. After 25 years in the business, I realized I have none of the answers.
Yeah.
But life is really in the gray area.
Yeah.
Whether somebody is negligent, whether they discriminate, whether they use excessive force. The way that we relate and deal with one another, whether it's in contractual relationships or out there in the public, we're dealing in a gray area, and we're bumping up against each other
Yeah.
and hurting each other to some degree.
Yeah.
And I know that you're working in the gray area in the service of the LGBT rights and integration, assimilation, or standout from society at large. It's hard to say what would be best for the community. But Rob, we're up against the top of the hour. I wish you the best, and you'll have to start getting ready for next year's party.
Oh my goodness, don't tell me that. Thank you so much for having me on. I hope that there was something that I said that might make a difference to somebody
One
else.
final going out. Sum it up for us in as best you can, the mission of the Utah Pride Center.
Our mission is a thriving LGBTQ community in Utah. And it's about look at each other, understand each other. I can only be myself if I can let you be you. So that's what I live by.
And you know what? That's what the BYU kid, Easton, he said that he was seen. So it's interesting that when you say look, that the community needs to be seen and that there's some healing aspects.
All of us want to be
that.
seen. That's all I think humans want, is to be seen and recognized and appreciated.
Well, thank you for coming by and seeing me. I appreciate it.
Cool.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening, folks. Talk with Ted. I'll be back on Tuesday with another guest. Until then, thanks for listening.